Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. I thank the Honourable George Vagnathan for this question, which I have great pleasure in presenting to this August House, how government's investment has improved the standard of living in the rural areas around Fiji, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, government is committed to rural development as it is a key national priority. This is an inspiration outlined in the 20-year National Development Plan. Our commitment is built on the foundation that the development of our rural areas is a solid measure of the progress of the nation, and government is fully aware that investment, Mr. Speaker, sir, in rural infrastructure is critically important to foster Fiji's economic development and prosperity. This will also contribute to higher productivity and growth, facilitates trade and connectivity, and promotes economic inclusion. In fact, the social and economic development of rural communities is integral to the well-being of any society and the economy. The Honourable Minister for Education has touched briefly, Mr. Speaker, sir, on some of the initiatives that the Ministry of Education is covering under the allocation, but I will speak specifically on a few areas, mainly rural water, rural electrification, rural infrastructure, and of course a few of the programs that is allocated to the Ministry for Rural Development. Mr. Speaker, sir, government provides allocation to various government ministries to implement capital projects and services. In recent years, we have witnessed substantial government investment in the development of rural infrastructure, provision of education and health services, rural electrification, access to water, income-generating opportunities, better communication, and transportation infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, sir, for the last 2 weeks, I have been visiting communities in the northern and western divisions, and before that, I was also in the eastern division, Mr. Speaker, sir, in the islands of Palau and Moturiki, and of course, Kandawu as well. And we were commissioning some of the government-funded projects that were implemented by my ministry. But I'm pleased to note the scale of new developments implemented recently. Not only rural development or the allocation projects that were given to the Ministry of Rural Development, but of course with the other key stakeholders as well. I'll begin with water, Mr. Speaker, sir. Water is a basic necessity in life, and government is committed to improve access of our rural communities to safe drinking water in adequate quantities. One thing, Mr. Speaker, sir, that I wish to mention here, and it's also the same with rural electrification, we are sort of into the second cycle of development, meaning some of the water projects that were done previously are no longer meeting the demands, because demands have increased in some communities, Mr. Speaker, sir. Same thing with electrification. Some were given diesel generators in previous years, but now most of them want the EFL grid because of the extension by government, and of course we are going clean, and most are into solar as well. So this is the new cycle of development that's happening in the rural areas, which is encouraging to see, Mr. Speaker, sir. But on water, as I've stated, new projects, particularly for catchments, for those that have directly from source, and then boreholes. And of course, there are places, and I will not go into the list, Mr. Speaker, sir, who are asking for ecological purification systems so that they can have better quality drinking water. Mr. Speaker, sir, a sum of 1.25 million has been allocated to the ministry in the last 2 financial years to address high priority water and sanitation program. Mr. Speaker, sir, on rural health centers and nursing stations, we have also seen upgrading and subdivisional hospitals to provide access to basic health care and medication. And the children in rural and maritime areas are in general have good access to health facilities, And of course, same thing with the education for their transportation with the subsidized allocation given from the ministry. So on infrastructure, government is committed to restoring, upgrading and building new roads, bridges and jetties through its rural roads program. Investment in roads alone have increased from 26 million in 2015 to 89 million in 2018 respectively. In the last three financial years since 2018, a total of 76 million was allocated towards jetty replacement program and upgrading of rural roads. In addition, Mr. Speaker, government invested around 6.9 million during the same period on shipping franchise schemes, which is in line with the NDP goal of ensuring safe, efficient, reliable and affordable shipping services, Mr. Speaker. On rural electrification, Mr. Speaker, government has progressively invested in rural electrification through grid extensions and the installation of solar home systems. And for some of these grid extensions, Mr. Speaker, the rural electrification team and EFL are just in the process of finalizing the connections, particularly with the inspections from EFL, so that the communities that have already been wired will get their connections to the EFL grid, Mr. Speaker. For that, for the last 3 years, government has spent about 34.4 million on rural electrification projects, Mr. Speaker. On some of the projects undertaken by the Ministry of Rural Development, I have been commissioning a lot of CAF-related projects. CAF is for community access road, footpaths and footbridges, Mr. Speaker. And across the 4 divisions, about 4.4 million were allocated in the last few years, benefiting more than 200 communities. And these projects have made accessibility easier and improved access to essential services for about 41,000 Fijians. To name a few, Mr. Speaker, the Nakinda village access road, they have never had roading before, Mr. Speaker, that will benefit the community. That came at a cost of around $47,000 for the initial access that has been cut, Mr. Speaker. I was in Ra last week, Nalamba District School, serving the Tikinas of Nalamba and Tokemalo, their access road, because the carrier was not willing to take the students directly to the school because of the state of... so we fixed that for the community, Mr. Speaker. On self-help program, we are focusing not only now on social projects, but more on the livelihoods approach as well, on the income-generating projects as a means of empowering rural communities. You know, women groups, Mr. Speaker, having solar freezers, their canteens, some farmers get their sheds for their animals, Mr. Speaker. These are examples of income-generating projects. And we are shifting slowly from the usual social projects into empowering rural communities, Mr. Speaker. And of course, this also supports the basic needs of life, including the access to water, communication and transportation in the social aspect of the projects, Mr. Speaker. On government's major investments, Mr. Speaker, I have highlighted a few. But water and sanitation, we continue to construct and upgrade water projects which allows access to community for the safe drinking water in their homes. Rural roads, I've mentioned this already, Mr. Speaker. It underpins the ability for the communities to access services such as health, education and water and so forth. And of course the franchise shipping services as well, Mr. Speaker. May I also add that government, in terms of its decentralization and empowerment and taking services closer to the rural people, we have also constructed DO or government stations in some of the areas, particularly the services of the DOs and assistant DOs, Mr. Speaker. To name a few, in the west. We are just in the process of completing Namarai in Ra, and hopefully that facility will be commissioned soon. Same thing in the north, Mr. Speaker, sir, that's for the west. In the north, Kumbulau in Bua is operating. Likewise, Lekutu in Bua as well, and there is a new DO station now in Wenkoro in Maduwata. In the Eastern Division, Mr. Speaker, sir, Nassau in Koro, Garani in Ngau, and of course, Kavala in Kandang. These are new projects that will help improve services and of course access to it as well by the rural communities. Of course, in the Central Division, in Dada, in Namosi, we have also constructed a DO's post there, Mr. Speaker. So these are the many projects that will bring a lot of benefits to our rural communities, Mr. Speaker. Each agency that's involved in rural development have their own monitoring systems as well, Mr. Speaker, sir. And for us in the Ministry of Rural Development, this is something that we take seriously. And of course, we are also reviewing policies in the ministry, particularly in trying to elevate those recipients from their current status. And we are calling it an incubation period of, say, the first 5 years for all project recipients, Mr. Speaker, sir. That is what we are looking into in the Ministry of Rural Development, so that we continue to have effective monitoring. With that as well, Mr. Speaker, sir, I've talked about income generating projects. One of the things that we are demanding from the recipients now is for them to have bank accounts. And not only that, but if they can have savings and of course possibility of having investments as well. And I'm pleased to say, Mr. Speaker, sir, that it's quite encouraging. Even in some of the projects, when it comes to monitoring, particularly those by IHRDP, some projects, they have issues, probably with previous management. But the good thing is they still have money in their savings account. So I wish to assure this August House, August Parliament, sorry, that we take monitoring seriously, and of course it will show its impact definitely in the years to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Honourable Piyotikondono, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Honourable Speaker. I thank the Honourable Minister for the answers that he gave for this substantive question. I just want to ask the Honourable Minister, how can his ministry assist rural-based communities that have independent water sources who have to relocate their catchment areas or the dam themselves because traditional communities have actually encroached into the, to the catchment area for their own survival, within because they do not have leases to these catchment areas. Like Port Authority, to retain their catchment area, would have to take an exclusive lease of the area to protect it. But rural communities use the same land for their own survival. Therefore, sometimes it becomes untenable. So how can they, what kind of assistance can you offer them? I know there's a whole lot of communities where the catchment areas have actually been, intruded into. So how can you, perhaps some funding, or how can your minister help in that regard to these communities? Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Honourable Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. First, we also have the rural water component with the Ministry of Infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, sir. And rural communities are advised if they can have their local water committees to look into their issues. Development is taking place at a very fast rate in rural areas, particularly with agriculture and the expansion of agriculture, livestock, or even with crops, Mr. Speaker, sir. And this threatens some of the water sources. There are few categories of water sourcing in Fiji. One is directly from from the streams, and dams are constructed. And of course, these are the communities that probably the honourable member is referring to. For these communities, I have talked about ensuring that they have quality drinking water, because it's coming directly from the source. It goes directly into the tap as well. So that's where the ecological purification system comes into. For those that, and there's a lot of these cases all over Fiji, Mr. Speaker, sir. The first thing that government does, whether it's the Ministry of Infrastructure through the Rural Water Team, or in the consultations with the Ministry of Rural Development, the first thing is to identify an alternative source within the area. Because particularly when the landowners are involved, we have to have the consent as well, ensuring that all the requirements are met before government can put the infrastructure in place. So the first option will always be, sir, for an alternative source. And that alternative source must not only serve the needs now, but one thing that learning from the past as well, based on the trend in the rural communities as well, population particularly, and I must here acknowledge all the Turangani-Koros and the maternity Tikinas, because right now in the Ministry of Rural Development, working together with Itau KFS, we have the profile of almost every village in Fiji. Their water source, type of houses, whether they have what type of energy is provided to the village, and their sanitation issues. It's a big improvement from where we started off. So when we have this information, we are able to plan in advance on the requirements of the area. And one thing that government is seriously looking into now, Mr. Speaker, sir, is not only this specific community, but the wider area. For example, I've talked a lot about Namara and Verata. They have water issues, and the water authority piping is way quite a distance away, and we are not even sure when we'll. So we are now working together with water authority to identify a source that not only will cater for Naimborabor or Tomburingyo, but it's the wider community, Mr. Speaker, so that it's a strategic approach rather than just reacting to the needs of one community only. So this is one thing that we're doing. Otherwise, borehole is the other alternative, or rainwater harvesting. Those are the two other alternatives that we have for these communities. So direct source from the dams, or boreholes, or rainwater harvesting. And rainwater harvesting is vulnerable as well, because dependent on the weather. But because it's Televu, no problem, sir.
I thank the Honourable Minister.